And we got a day that we thought would be fairly quiet that suddenly got very loud in the way that over the last 2 years it has typically gotten loud. Don Van Natta and Seth Wickersham wrote something. We will talk about it for a lot of the show today, but I will say up front two things. One, Don Van Natta is going to join us for the better part of the 5 o'clock hour coming up at 5 o'clock, starting Not My Beat segment, and he's just going to stick with us for like 2-3 segments and go through this story at length. So Don Van Natta, like you will not hear him anywhere else, 5 o'clock here on the Hoffman Show. The other thing I'll say is this, though. This is the first time one of these stories has dropped where it doesn't feel like the consequences will or should be in Washington. And I want to get into the substance of this story, and it's a story with nothing but villains, and there is a lot. We could do the whole 3 hours on the substance alone of this story. But we can do it with an emotional separation that says, this isn't an attack on the franchise you love anymore. It's an attack on the NFL, certainly the way I'm going to opine on it, because, God, they look bad in this. If for some reason you're an outsized John Gruden fan, then you might not like some of the stuff I'm going to say. But there was this natural defensiveness amongst Commanders, Washington football fans, when we would talk about these stories over the last couple of years because it felt like an attack on the team. And I don't know if I'm feeling this differently. Look, I'm a journalist, at least an opinion journalist. I have made no secret over the course of my career. Like, I didn't grow up here. This is not an irrational, emotional fan thing. Not that, like, for instance, the Junkies in the morning, like, that's their thing. They grew up here. And they should have that and bring that. There's value to that in this job. That's not the way I approach it because that's not who I am. It wouldn't be authentic. I come at this from a very journalistic lens. So hopefully I'm not misreading the situation, but I'm also a human being who's lived here for a long time, has a lot of emotional investment in the team because it, guides my day-to-day of my job in my life and has for the better part of, it's about to be 8 full years going on year 9 coming up here in August, the anniversary of my arrival in D.C. They rolled out no carpets, nothing. They did charge me full price of the toll on 267. But it doesn't feel the same in a good way. It feels like this is a continued reckoning about things that happened in the past and it without attacking the current team, so nobody needs to be defensive about it. I think we can all agree amongst rational folks that just because this team is being sold to Josh Harris doesn't mean that the things that allowed us to get to this point don't need to be rectified. And it's one thing if you want to say, well, Dan's selling, leave him alone, just like let him go on his yacht. I'm not going to sit here and defend Dan Snyder. I'm not going to sit here and say he should be let off the hook because he sold and he gets a bunch of money. That ain't going to be my take. But I at least understand the rationale there because you don't want to hear about him anymore. But when it comes to Goodell specifically and the NFL, we can't do business this way. And that is why this particular story, on a substantive level and on an emotional one, considering we are now 8 days from the sale being finalized, hits differently than the others. If you haven't gotten into any of the details yet, you've just kind of heard there's a story floating in ether. If you've been in like a skiff or something all day and you just got out, there was another ESPN story that dropped. It's significant. The substance of it is that Van Natta and Wickersham display the thread from the leaked John Gruden emails to Snyder's demise and how who leaked them could be any. There's a long list of suspects, all with their own motives. It shows the internal politics of the league. It shows the pettiness of many of the individuals involved. It shows immense amounts of selfish and otherwise bad behavior. It shows, I would say, in some levels, a gross incompetence to the people in charge of the league, including Goodell himself. And there are no heroes here. There are no redeeming figures in the story at all. Depending on your motives at some point while you read it, you find yourself, quote unquote, cheering for bad actors at certain points because it would help you achieve the thing that you want, whatever your version of justice is. Like, in a way, you're like, hey, yeah, go John Gruden. You throw those lawsuits in the Nevada court. But also, I'm glad your ass got fired because homophobic, racist, and otherwise misogynistic and terrible, bad behavior and language is not something that an NFL head coach should have in their repertoire. That's not a controversial statement. If you're a homophobe, especially of the Las Vegas Raiders, home of the first openly gay player in the NFL in Carl Nassib, if you're a racist in a league that's 70% black, if you're a misogynist in a league that has traditionally treated women not very well and should do better because as a society, hate to break it to some of y'all, but we need to do a little bit better, slash a lot better, then you don't deserve the $10 million a year leadership position. It's pretty straightforward. But hey, if you're going to sue over getting fired from that, and that's going to open up another can of worms, and you're going to burn the mother bleeper down when it needs to be burned down in some of those same exact areas that I just talked about that you yourself got in trouble for, go John Gruden. It's a weird story to process through those lenses of the heroes and the villains and the complex relationships at play. What I want to do next is kind of distill it down, less abstract, less macro, more micro. One, and most importantly, where we'll spend the most time next, is on Roger Goodell. How he got successfully blackmailed, according to the reporting, according to sources in the story, by Dan Snyder. How Snyder, the second person we'll look at, self-owned into selling the team. And third, I do want to circle back to Gruden and kind of where he is in all of this. That's next. We'll dive into the details on the Hoffman Show. Van Natta himself at 5. We're on the Team 980. We're on the free Odyssey app, and we're streaming live on YouTube. I want to dive into the substance of this story, though, because there is a lot here. Again, it's through a different lens, considering where we are in the timeline of, investigations and the sale, with the sale just 8 days away from being completed. And no, in case anyone's wondering, this story will not remotely affect the sale. The agreement's in place, everything's done. And frankly, of all the ESPN stories, Snyder comes out of this one fairly unscathed. There's some bad Snyder stuff in here, but it's all stuff that we knew and could have guessed. And frankly, if I was in Dan's position, I can't say, no, I find it hard-pressed to see how I'd ever be in Dan's position in a million ways. But if you were, and you were negotiating punishment with your boss, you'd want to do some stuff that puts you in a position to get the lightest possible punishment where you got to pick your own, certainly. Whether you basically blackmail your boss to do it or not is a different question. I don't see myself doing that, in part because I'd be too scared to. But that's kind of actually where I want to start with Goodell, right? So Goodell comes out of this story, to me, looking the worst. I think this is a legitimate problem for him reputationally. I do not think it will be enough to affect his contract extension, which should be finalized as soon as next week, along with this sale. I do think there's going to be some issues for him with certain owners. Again, I don't think it's going to amount to a mass of owners because most people just want to keep it moving. And if Goodell is willing to take bullets like he took for Snyder, for them in the future, that's someone that you want in the commissionership if you're the owner. And ultimately, if you're the owners, ultimately they're in charge. Is that how they should be thinking? Is, wow, when I get in trouble, this guy will fight for me. No, you should be thinking about how you don't get in trouble. But that's not typically how business works. And hey, if that's considered a perk, and by the way, Goodell's also good at generating revenue, probably going to be more than enough to save his job. But the damning details in here are that, according to sources, speaking of Van Natta and Wickersham, speaking to ESPN, there was a meeting after the Wilkinson investigation. And there had been this common interest agreement, which folks like Melanie Colbert and Megan Imbert and their lawyers, Katz and Banks, have been up in arms about. And my guess is they knew some of this or had heard some of this, and now reporters get it on the record, or into the record, if you will. Obviously, sources are anonymous because the sensitivity of all this stuff, but they get it into the record about the details of just how deep that common interest agreement was and how it went down. And what went down is they have this meeting because they have to, and instead of defending Snyder, like you'd think a lawyer would do, lawyers from Reed Smith, a New York-based firm who is notoriously aggressive, and some would say underhanded and dirty, they have these emails from other league personnel that are really damaging. In the story, they say they're not homophobic, they're not misogynistic, they're not racist, but they are off-color, and the language is a bad look for the NFL, and that includes NFL legal counsel Jeff Pash. And some of these emails are between NFL folks, including Pash and Bruce Allen. And so Snyder's tactics there are essentially to blackmail the league into giving him what he wants. And what happens is, instead of going, you're not blackmailing us, and now you're actually in more trouble for trying, this is absurd, Goodell, who had, according to sources, been planning on lowering the hammer on Snyder, reversed course and said, actually, let's work with Dan. Let's see. And to the point that Snyder himself is weighing in on language in the press release. And if you remember when the $10 million fine and all that stuff got announced, there's this language about how Dan and Tanya had started to right the ship, and this stuff happened in the past. And that was kind of the start of the narrative that Dan continued to give ultimately to Congress and anyone else that he leaked to, that this was all Bruce Allen's fault, and that he, the owner of the team, for many of the incidents discussed, even when before Allen's time, he, man who was directly accused later by multiple people later accused of sexual assault by sexual misconduct by Tiffany Johnston, and it came out, had been previously accused of sexual assault in the 2009 incident on his plane. He was innocent. He was just, my hands were too far off. Now that they're on, we're going to steal it in the right place. And that started with an official league press release announcing the largest fine in league history. It made no sense. I remember I was part-time still at the time. I was doing overtime on the Fan, and I was on that night. And I just remember thinking, it was bad enough that you give the biggest fine in league history, the largest you're allowed to, but not bad enough that you'll tell us what happened. Not bad enough that it's he's not suspended more definitively. That it's this, you'll stay away, mealy-mouthed, not really suspension. And it turns out that's because that's exactly what Dan wanted. Some might say that's good lawyering. His lawyers got a better deal for their client. I look at it through the lens of Goodell and say, hey, man, if you're the commissioner of the league, you need to have a better backbone than that. You also need to have better lawyers than that. This is embarrassing. It's embarrassing. It's damning, and it is confirming in a lot of ways the worst fears of how dirty of a process this was for the folks that got hurt in the first place. And this is a question that, I'm hoping to have Lisa Banks or Deborah Katz on over the next couple of days to parse this out. But to me, this should open some legal loopholes or some legal holes potentially for the NFL, some legal liability, because Melanie and Megan and Tiffany and all these women that have spoken out, the former cheerleaders, the former employees, have said, we participated in this investigation because the NFL and Beth Wilkinson gave us their and her word that there would be a written report. And then all of a sudden the plug got pulled. Why? Well, it turns out that they got blackmailed, and that Snyder, the person that they were investigating, was the one who pulled the plug on the report coming out. And again, I'm not saying that through the lens of attacking Dan in this particular case. I mean, it's not great for him, but what do you expect? He's the beneficiary of low expectations. For Goodell in the NFL, how do you ever convincingly conduct an investigation again? How can you be trusted? And, what eventually comes out of this is the Gruden emails later get leaked. And there's a lot, obviously, in the ESPN story, and we'll get into a lot of this with Van Natta at 5 o'clock of who could have leaked them, why, all that kind of stuff. But that stuff leads to the congressional investigation directly. After the Gruden emails leak, Congress is like, all right, enough. Like, you guys are a mess. We're going to do this. And that ultimately leads to the sequence of events that Dan sells the team. So it's hilarious, like objectively funny, right? If we're going to take any humor out of this, any schadenfreude, any whatever, it's that Dan negotiating his own easy punishment, in part thanks to these Gruden emails, and then potentially being the person that leaks them for reasons that we'll have to get into later, launches the sequence of events that makes him sell the team. You know what it makes me think of, Anthony? Remember when we watched cartoons as a kid and the Wile E. Coyote Roadrunner?
Of course.
It makes me think of Dan is Wile E. Coyote, and there's a big old thing of TNT right behind him. And all he sees is the match in front of him, like the fuse. And he thinks that fuse goes to John Gruden. He thinks that fuse goes anywhere other than himself. And he's like, ha, lights it, and he's just staring. And it just goes and goes out of sight. He's like, oh, where's the explosion? Where's the explosion? Where's the explosion? And sure enough, it loops around behind him and kaboom. That's what this feels like. That's what this feels like. Which in a way actually gets us to Gruden too. Because Gruden lost his job. But in all of this, he's sitting there being like, they tried to blow me up. And it's like, why did they try to blow you up? Is it because you were critical of them? Maybe that's why Goodell wanted to. That's part of this story. But it's also because you were a terrible person too. That's the thing that I think my highest level takeaway in this is a story of 100% villains. If you want your heroes, as I've said before, if you want to thank someone for the team being sold and all this getting to the point that it is, that this is, we can look at this with more objectivity and less emotional investment in the team and how it might affect the team. And Ron Rivera's not going to have to answer questions about this. This is all completely irrelevant. I don't even think Josh Harris will answer 8 days from now or 9 days from now, whenever it is that Harris meets the press for the first time, which I'm sure he will. You think he's going to get asked about this? He'll get asked vaguely about this. What does it mean to take over a team that's been through all this stuff, blah, blah, blah. And he'll probably be like, well, I don't really want to focus on that. I'm just excited for the opportunity, yada, yada. But he's not going to get answered specific questions about anything in this story. And so it's so if you want your heroes, Melanie, Megan, Tiffany, on down the list. However, if you want villains, Goodell, check. Gruden, check. Snyder, check. Jeff Pash, check. Bruce Allen, check. Anybody in the story today, all villains, 100%.
What's up, kiddos? It's your boy Clinton Yates from ESPN. It's the Hoffman Show on the Team 980. Tell your mama I said what's up.